Welcome to the channel about news from around the world. While you subscribe and like it, we're going to start.
The EU continues to talk a lot about economic independence and self-sufficiency, referring primarily to key knowledge-intensive industries. But in reality, the alliance countries are only becoming more and more intellectually and technologically dependent. The deal with Intel, an American corporation that promised Brussels to develop large-scale European production of semiconductors and microchips, proves once again that the alliance is unable to cope with its own problems. Poland's Prime Minister announced the largest foreign investment in the country's history and assured the US ambassador that construction of an Intel megafactory in the Lower Silesian suburb of Wrocław would strengthen transatlantic ties. And he is surely right. 4.2 billion euros invested in production would indeed bind Poland and the entire EU even more strongly to Washington, without whose approval the world's biggest developer of new chips and microchips would not have been able to jump across the Atlantic. Naturally, the know-how, technology and secrets would remain under the full control of the Americans, who would not share them with their European allies. If the latter had them, Brussels would prefer to develop its own facilities. And consequently, the US would also retain the right to prohibit or allow European manufacturers to export to third countries certain goods containing US chips, even if they will be produced in future Intel factories in Europe. Washington has repeatedly exercised this right, conditional on contracts and US law, blocking French arms shipments to Egypt, for example. The ambitious plans of the Americans will also, in a direct, financial sense, cost the European Union a lot of money. To boost domestic semiconductor and chip production capacity, Brussels recently passed a special law allowing European governments to generously subsidize the construction of new plants, megafactories. It was done to the considerable benefit of Intel Corporation, which successfully haggled for a long time for maximum favorable conditions and financial support. Naturally, only the most wealthy countries of the alliance were able to afford such expenses, which deprived poor, small countries, including Baltic republics, of any chances to get any of numerous enterprises of Intel or other large developers and manufacturers of modern electronics. The conditions of competition were too unequal, which, of course, contradicts the rules of the European Union, but as it always happens in the most sensitive situations of the alliance, it turns out that there are still the most equal among nominally equal allies. In this case, Germany, Poland, France, Spain, Italy and Ireland were able to agree with Intel with support from Brussels. Earlier Berlin announced about successful completion of negotiations with Intel that the agreement of the Americans to invest 30 billion € into the construction of a megafactory in Magdeburg and to set up semiconductor manufacture there would cost about 10 billion € in state subsidies. Initially a subsidy of 6.8 billion was in question, but the Americans, citing inflation, adjustments to plans and changes in the world economy, pushed for a juicier carrot from Berlin. Categorically objecting German Finance Minister Christian Lindner was not heard. Chancellor Olaf Scholz has already said that Germany should become the leading semiconductor manufacturer and help Europe reduce its dependence on its main supplier, China. Previously, the alliance talked at length about the need to achieve independence from foreign suppliers of strategically important products and raw materials. Microchips and semiconductors are at the top of the list of key products. It is assumed that the alliance was concerned about its own, notionally its own as they would be owned by the Americans, production due to the supply crisis resulting from the pandemic and supply chain disruption. But it is clear that Brussels would also like to prepare for the fact that Taiwan, which now covers the lion's share of Europe's microchip needs, will one way or another rejoin China. And reducing dependence on Beijing has been declared an economic and political priority in Brussels. Intel may indeed build megafactories in Europe with generous subsidies from the European Union, but contrary to Brussels' claims, this will not make the alliance less dependent on foreign suppliers and more self-sufficient. On the contrary, it will make it even more dependent on the US, which is probably Washington's goal. As strange as it sounds, the Europeans will also be more dependent on supplies from China, since no one has cancelled its leadership in the global extraction of rare earth metals, without which semiconductors cannot be produced. New American plants in Europe will only increase its demand for Chinese raw materials. So what is the point of the extremely expensive pan-European microelectronics industry development program? The Poles, for example, rely heavily on Ukrainian refugees for additional jobs. This is certainly not a bad thing. Additional tax revenues are also welcome, and shortened supply chains can help reduce production costs. Perhaps all this will help offset the costs of luring Intel, but it is by no means in line with the declared policy of strategic autonomy of the EU and, if we remember the subsidies, its policy of fair competition and equal treatment of all allied states.
Thank you for watching. If you're interested, subscribe and leave a comment.